Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm going to be doing another quick tip video here on YouTube. I have a little series called Quilting Quick Tips. If you want to check out the other quick tips I have, there is a playlist on my main channel, so you can just scroll down to get to that playlist and find out all the other quick tips. So in today's video, we're going to be making half square triangles in a few different ways. So we're going to be making them one at a time, 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time. And there is a 16 at a time one. I rarely use the 16 at a time half square triangles unless I'm doing something special. These are typically my go-tos. I will also have a half square triangle cheat sheet cutting instruction PDF that you can download. That will be linked below this video, and I'll have measurements for all of the different sizes of half square triangles. Now, one thing to note is I always make mine just slightly larger. That way I can trim them down so they're perfect in case my sewing isn't. And if you have a pattern that calls for a specific half square triangle and it doesn't say that you're going to have overage, a lot of times I will go ahead and add a half of an inch or an inch to that pattern depending on what kind it is, just to give myself some wiggle room. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to set these guys out of the way, and we're just going to get started with the basic one at a time half square triangle. So to start out, we're going to need 2 squares that are the same size, and on the back of one of the squares I have drawn a line from corner to corner using my friction pin and my ruler, and this will come off with heat, and also it's going to be in the seam allowance, so you don't really need to worry about that showing up. We're going to take this and place our other square right side down on top, and then we are going to sew right along that drawn line. So I've sewn on my drawn line, and now we can go ahead and cut 1/4 of an inch away from our sewn line. However, before I do that, I actually like to press my fabric back first. That way I can use that pre-existing fabric to help line up my edges. I'll be using my Laura Star iron, and I'm just going to give it a quick press, and then we can come over here and trim off. We're going to trim 1/4 of an inch away from our sewn line, just like that. Now you could have sewn another line right here, another 1/2 inch away from the original line, and then you'll have an extra spare half square triangle, like a tiny one, but you could use that for a side project. I'm not doing that today. And then here we are. Now you could also go back and press this open if you wanted. I like to press to one side first, and then I'll come back in and press that seam open. I honestly don't press open very often. I tend to press to one side more because I feel like it makes that seam stronger, but you could press open at this stage if you wanted. And then we're going to take our half square triangle now, and you'll notice it's a little bit wonky, but we're going to trim it up, and we're cutting 2.5 inch squares today, 2.5 inch half square triangles. And then, like I mentioned, I gave myself a little bit of extra around my outside edge. I'm going to be using the diagonal line on my ruler here. I'm lining it up with the seam line, and then I'm also making sure that my diagonal line point is right where these meet and right where these two fabrics meet. So if these 2 points are accurate, your half square triangle is going to look accurate, even if maybe your sewing got a little bit wonky somewhere in here. So now we're going to just trim off those edges, and I'll usually trim off 2, then I'm going to turn it, and then I'll trim off the other 2. And again, I'm making sure that that point up there is lining up with the line on my ruler. And so here's our finished half square triangle, and you can see this point is nice and accurate, so when we put this together with other blocks, these points are going to be perfect. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and set our 1 at a time half square triangle aside, and we're going to go and work on our 2 at a time half square triangles. You'll notice this starting squares are a little bit larger. Like I said, all the measurements will be below. And then on the wrong side of one of my pieces, I drew a line from corner to corner again. And when I'm drawing these lines, a lot of times I will use this diagonal line along one of the edges of my square just to make sure that that diagonal line is straight with my fabric. Okay, so we're going to take this and again put these right sides together. But instead of sewing directly on our line this time, we're actually going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from our line on both sides. And I just use this line as a guide for my presser foot and just run my presser foot right along that line. So as you can see, I've sewn 1/4 of an inch on either side of our drawn line, and then now we're going to go ahead and cut right on that line to cut our half square triangles in half, and that's going to leave us with 2 half square triangles. And then again, I'm just going to go ahead and press them. I always set that seam first. Oop, my steam was so strong it blew off that one at a time triangle. But I just give them a quick press with my Laura Star iron. I love that thing. And then now we have our 2 half square triangles, and we just need to trim them up. Now you can trim them up one at a time, just like I showed you for the 1 at a time half square triangle. And again, I'm just going to line up my diagonal line on my ruler and trim that off. And this is really easy to see with the red and white, so it makes it really easy, but I just line that up right down there at the corner again, and then I'll just repeat that process for our second half square triangle. And that's pretty much it for our 2 at a time half square triangles. Now we'll go ahead and see how to make them 4 at a time. So as you can see, our starting squares are just a little bit larger. They're going to keep getting bigger, but I haven't drawn any lines on these, and that is because we don't need any lines. However, we will be cutting these on the bias, so I do recommend using something like Mary Ellen's Best Press or pre-starching your fabric. We will be cutting these diagonally. As you can see here, these were cut on grain, so there isn't much stretch, but if we look at this one, we're going to be cutting this on the diagonal, and you can see there's quite a bit of stretch right there, and that can cause your blocks to distort. So using something like Mary Ellen's Best Press or pre-starching is a great way to handle that. I'm just going to go ahead and spray a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press on there, and then I just press it until it's dry. You can spray one side or both sides depending on how much structure you want. I'm just doing one side, and then I'm just pressing it, like I said, until it's dry. And then you'll see right here we have quite a bit less stretch just by spraying it on one side. So now we're ready to move on. We're going to place these 2 squares right sides together, and we're going to sew all the way around all 4 edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When we're done, we'll come back and cut on the diagonals. As you can see here, we've sewn all the way around our squares, and now I'm going to just give them a quick press to set that seam, and then we're going to take them to our cutting board and we're going to cut on the diagonal. Again, I'm going to use that diagonal line on my ruler to make this cut, and I really should have gotten a larger ruler here. If you have one, I highly recommend it. As you can see, I got a little wild there on the bottom. It's not going to matter too much because I did give myself wiggle room, and that's going to result in 4 half square triangles, and then we just need to press those really quickly. Now you can trim these up 1 at a time just like I've shown, or you can cut them 2 at a time, and I do this to save time, but you do have to be a little bit more careful to keep those half square triangles accurate. So we're going to take our half square triangles and again place them right sides together with opposite colors touching. So as you can see here, the red is going to be in opposite colors, and since we've pressed towards the red, it makes it really easy for me to nest those seams, and I just push them together as tight as possible. I can feel those ridges touching, and when you pull them back, you can see that that red fabric is but right up next to each other, and that's what you want in order to have both of these come out accurate when you cut them 2 at a time like this. So now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm placing my diagonal line now on the seam line, the stitch line of that top half square triangle, and then I can go ahead and trim off my excess. Again, I'm going to be really careful. I'm going to turn this around, keeping them both together, making sure they don't come apart. And again, I'm going to line up that diagonal line on my ruler, again with the stitch line. Make sure it's on that stitch line. And then again, just trim off that excess. And then as you can see here, now we have 2 pretty perfectly trimmed half square triangles, and that's a little bit of a time saver when you're making a lot of half square triangles. So now we just need to trim up our other 2. I'm going to use that 2 at a time method, and you just really want to take your time on this though and make sure that you've got those seams but right up next to each other so that you keep both your half square triangles accurate. And here we have our 4 at a time half square triangles. You can see how fast and easy that was. That is one of my favorite methods. Like I mentioned, you do have bias seams on that one, so just keep that in mind when you're using that method. Now we're going to move on to our 8 at a time half square triangles. So now we have an even bigger set of squares to be working with, and again I have gone ahead and pre-drawn a line from corner to corner on both diagonals of that white fabric. We're going to place those 2 fabrics right sides together, and this time we're going to be sewing 1/4 inch away on both diagonals. So you can see we're going to sew 2 lines going this direction, and then we're going to sew 2 lines going the opposite direction right along those drawn lines. And here we have our completed sewn piece. We've sewn 1/4 of an inch away from both of our diagonal lines. I know it's hard to see on that gingham. I'm going to set those seams really quickly. Now we're going to cut our piece in half vertically, in half horizontally, and then along both of those diagonal drawn lines. And that's going to give us our 8 half square triangles. So first we go with a diagonal line. I'm not moving anything, I'm just moving my ruler. I'm lining my ruler up right along those corners, cutting my second diagonal line right in between those stitch lines. And now we're going to cut a horizontal line. This piece was 7 inches to start, so I'm going to be cutting at 3.5 inches, and I'm also using that diagonal line on my ruler again to line up with one of the lines I've previously cut. I just use any markers I can to try and make sure I'm as accurate as possible, and go ahead and cut that horizontal line. I'm going to scoot everything back together if it moved at all. And now we're going to cut a vertical line to cut that square in half, again at our 3.5 inch marker. And I'm also using that horizontal line there to line up with the cut I made previously. And now we're going to cut our vertical line. And that's super easy. You can see we have 2, 4, 6, 8 half square triangles, and we just need to get these all nice and pressed and trimmed, and we're ready to move on. So again, I just lined them all up here. I'm pressing everything towards my dark fabric for this, but like I said before, you can press them open if you prefer. I like pressing to one side unless I have a specific reason to press open. For example, if I have a lot of blocks that are all coming together and I don't know which way they're going to be going. But here are 8 at a time, half square triangles, and like I said, we just need to trim them up. You can trim these up using the 1 at a time method. That way is definitely a little bit more accurate, or again, you can use that 2 at a time method I showed you. And that's it. Here are our half square triangles. We have 1 at a time, 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time. I think my go-tos are the 4 at a time and 8 at a time, but these 1 at a time half square triangles are perfect if you're using up a lot of your scraps and you just don't have enough to make them any larger. I like the 2 at a time if patterns call for it, but for the most part, I go with my 4 at a time or my 8 at a time because I like to make them all, as many as I can and as fast as I can. That's going to be it for today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Don't forget to download the cheat sheet that I have below. It has instructions for half square triangles, sizes varying from 1 inch to, I believe I went up to 8 inches. I've also included the math on that download so that you can create your own if you have a size that I did not provide. Thanks so much for joining me today. As always, if you like this video, please make sure to thumbs up and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on anything new. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time.